Hollywood actor Dwayne Johnson goes out for an evening walk and accidentally witnesses an attempted assault. Without hesitation, he engages in a brutal fight with 3 thugs and rescues the girl. It turns out the attackers work for a powerful mafia boss, and one of them is his son. A $10 million bounty is placed on Dwayne's head, triggering a relentless manhunt. Everyone becomes a potential enemy: mercenaries, bystanders, corrupt cops. No one can be trusted. Dwayne and the girl flee, hide, fight, and survive, facing death at every turn. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. There are many more thrilling stories coming just for you. The sky above the outskirts of Marlow Creek shimmered with the last golden hues of the setting sun, casting elongated shadows across the worn stone path that snaked through the old forest. The air was still, warm, touched by the scent of pine resin and wildflowers. Nature whispered through the rustling canopy and the distant babble of a narrow stream coiling its way through mossy roots. This was where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson often wandered. Not as the man on the screens, not the icon from posters or premieres, but just as himself, a man of muscle and memory, walking in search of silence. He was dressed simply, a charcoal gray t-shirt clinging to the broad contours of his chest, jeans that bore dust and history, and worn boots that padded gently along the soil. His phone was left behind on purpose. No entourage. No destination. Just footsteps and breath. Dwayne had always found something sacred in the quiet of untamed places. Between the chaos of a fame-fed life and the noise of cities, this refuge offered stillness, a rare and sacred thing. He had followed the path deeper than usual, not out of intent, but instinct. As if drawn by something waiting ahead. As he moved beneath the arch of 2 ancient oaks, something shifted. It wasn't a sound, not at first, more of a pause in the pulse of the forest, a sudden breath held by the trees themselves. Then it came. A scream. Shattering the evening calm like glass against concrete. It was sharp, unmistakable. A woman's voice, strangled by fear. Pleading. Calling for help. Without hesitation, his body responded before thought could. Legs surged forward. Adrenaline flushed through him like a firestorm. Branches whipped past. Bark scraped his arms. Dirt kicked up underfoot. The scream rang again, closer now, laced with dread and resistance. His breath turned into rhythm, short, steady, focused. Bursting through a thicket, Dwayne reached the edge of a sunlit clearing and froze. Down the hill, nestled against a rusted fence post and an old cattle barn, a scene of cruelty unfolded. 3 men circled a young woman, no older than her mid-20s. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her hands trembling, trying to shield herself. The largest of the 3 held her by the wrist, while another laughed, low and guttural. The third began to unbuckle his belt, eyes cold, detached from humanity. Her terror painted across her face told the rest. Dwayne's fists clenched. He stepped forward, no words needed. The first man turned at the sound of boots against gravel, eyes narrowing. He said something, a sneer curling across his lip, but Dwayne didn't register the words. The man lunged, perhaps mistaking him for another passerby to scare off. Mistake. Dwayne's shoulder drove into the attacker's chest like a battering ram. The force sent the man sprawling back against the fence, a sharp crack ringing out as wood splintered behind him. The second man rushed in, a switchblade glinting from his pocket. Dwayne pivoted on instinct, grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisted, and dropped the man to the ground with a bone-snapping throw. A short cry followed as the attacker writhed, cradling a broken arm. The third assailant, seeing the momentum shift, drew a longer blade, this one serrated, pitted with old rust. His movements were frantic, driven more by fear than skill. He lunged. Dwayne sidestepped. The blade grazed his side, drawing a thin line of blood, but it was shallow. With a roar, Dwayne slammed his elbow into the attacker's temple, then grabbed his wrist and wrenched the knife from his hand. A quick jerk, and the bone snapped audibly. The man crumpled to the ground in a heap of curses and agony. For a moment, only breathing filled the space. Heavy, shaken gasps from the girl. Controlled, grounding inhales from Dwayne. The men, broken and stunned, scrambled into the trees, dragging one another with what strength they could muster. They vanished into the thick woods, not daring to look back. Dwayne turned to the girl, her knees giving out. He caught her gently, his strong arms wrapping around her trembling frame. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and the corner of her lip bled. Her dress hung in tatters, but her eyes, though clouded by panic, searched his with recognition. Not as the celebrity, but the man who had stepped in. The one who hadn't hesitated. They didn't speak. He didn't ask. Instead, he guided her back through the woods, steadying her as they crossed the stream and retraced the steps he'd taken in silence only an hour earlier. The twilight had thickened. The wind picked up. Nature had returned to its rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. His cabin was nestled at the base of a ridge, a place forgotten by maps and shielded by tall trees and stone. He opened the door, led her inside, and secured the bolt behind them. The fire was out, but the space was warm. Earthy. Safe. He brought her water, a clean towel, a sweatshirt that swallowed her petite frame. Bit by bit, the panic left her limbs. Her voice returned, weak and hoarse. Her name was Lila. She had been followed. The men weren't strangers, not entirely. They worked under a name few dared to whisper in Marlow Creek, Marzano. He was more than just a local kingpin. Marzano ran the supply lines, the dirty contracts, the land deals behind every business front within 3 counties. What Dwayne had just done, he realized, wasn't a rescue. It was a declaration of war. One of those men had been Marzano's son. Lila knew this. She knew they wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Dwayne didn't flinch. He didn't second guess. He'd seen enough of men like Marzano in the hidden shadows of Hollywood, producers with blood-stained contracts, investors with offshore secrets. But this was something else. This was personal. Outside, the forest held its breath again. Inside, the flame of purpose began to burn. They slept in shifts. Dwayne kept a firearm nearby, though he preferred his hands. The girl rested fitfully, her breathing uneven, while Dwayne sat by the window, watching the woods, waiting. He knew what was coming. Knew this wouldn't be buried under silence, and just before dawn broke, news arrived. $10 million. That was the price placed on Dwayne Scala Johnson's head. Not in whispers. Not behind closed doors. This was out in the open. The entire underworld knew it now. Mercenaries. Hired muscle. Crooked cops. Informants dressed as neighbors. A bounty broadcast like wildfire, and it was just the beginning. By the time the first rays of morning slanted through the narrow windows of the cabin, Dwayne was already on his feet, packing supplies with methodical precision. His movements were silent, efficient, years of discipline behind every motion. Cans of food, purified water, a hunting knife, a loaded sidearm, spare magazines. He knew they had no more than a few hours before the weight of that bounty rippled through the quiet backroads of Marlow Creek and into every pair of hungry eyes desperate enough to take a shot at $10 million. Lila stood nearby, wrapped in his hoodie, clutching a steaming cup of coffee with both hands. The trembling had stopped, replaced now by something steadier. She wasn't a victim anymore. Something inside her had shifted too. Dwayne gave her a nod, no need for explanation. They both understood. This place wasn't safe anymore. No place would be. Not yet. Outside, the forest was drenched in morning dew, but the air carried tension now, as if the world itself had caught wind of the bounty. They moved fast, cutting through trails only Dwayne knew, avoiding the main roads. His truck was hidden off the service route 2 miles east, under a tarp and surrounded by branches, waiting for a moment like this. When they reached it, Dwayne checked underneath. Inside, even the trees above, no wires, no tracks. So far, so good. They drove in silence for the first hour, the hum of tires over gravel and cracked asphalt acting as a buffer between them and the chaos they'd left behind. Every turn they made, every rearview glance, brought the same thought: someone was watching. Someone could be following. The paranoia wasn't a byproduct of fear, it was logic now. In the small town of Harlan, they stopped for fuel. Dwayne adjusted his cap low and pulled the hoodie further over Lila's head. He didn't like it. The town was too quiet. Too normal. A gas station clerk eyed them a beat too long. A man in a faded flannel jacket stepped out of a diner and stood just a little too still, pretending to scroll through a phone that clearly wasn't turned on. Another leaned against a payphone, back turned but still listening. The network was already awake. They left without a word. As they pulled onto the road, Dwayne spotted a black SUV turning out from an alley 2 blocks behind them. Tinted windows. No front license plate. His foot pressed the gas harder. The chase had begun. For miles, the SUV kept its distance, like a shark circling beneath the waves. Dwayne took detours, back roads, even short bursts down abandoned logging paths to throw them off. Still, they followed. At one point, 2 more vehicles joined the pursuit. By then, Dwayne knew escape wasn't the answer, they had to disappear completely. Near the border of Pinegate County, Dwayne veered off into the hills. He knew a place carved into the cliffs above Lake Everton, where the signal dropped and no drone or satellite could trace a soul. A dead zone. A sliver of time. He parked the truck behind a rock formation, covered the tires, and led Lila into a narrow cave system hidden behind a waterfall. Inside, it was cold and dark. The rush of water outside muffled all sound, giving them temporary peace. They lit a small fire, kept it low. Lila sat close to him, and in the flickering light, she finally told him the full story. She had once worked as a financial analyst for a small logistics company, what she thought was just a shipping hub. But over time, she began to notice strange patterns in the accounts: massive transfers from shell corporations, routed through offshore havens. Names that didn't match records. Codes that pointed to ghost shipments. She made the mistake of asking questions. Within a week, her apartment had been ransacked. Her office access revoked. She went underground, trying to gather proof. What she found led directly to Marzano. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. The logistics company was just one spoke in a massive wheel of organized crime. And when she threatened to go to the feds, they found her. That night in the clearing hadn't been random. It had been a warning. Dwayne listened in silence, absorbing every detail. He wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore, he was guarding a spark that could burn the entire underworld to the ground. But time was running out. They couldn't hide in caves forever. The world above was moving. Already, reports were surfacing, online forums buzzing with chatter about a girl with chestnut hair seen with a big guy who looked like an action star. Every face in every diner might be a watcher. Every cop car might belong to Marzano's payroll. The rules had changed. Civilization itself was a minefield. At night, they moved again. Dwayne traded his truck for an old dirt bike hidden under a tarp outside a mechanic's barn, an old favor, paid in silence years ago. With no lights and no sound, they glided through the dark, hugging backroads, avoiding towns altogether. In one small village near the edge of Duskwater Valley, they found brief shelter with a woman named Margot, a hermit healer with eyes that saw more than she admitted. She didn't ask who they were. She just offered soup, a clean place to rest, and a shortwave radio tuned to underground channels. Through the crackle, Dwayne heard the voices. Mentions of a man matching his build spotted near Harlan. Rumors of a reward increasing by the hour. Reports of attacks in nearby counties, assassins failing and disappearing. One name kept surfacing. The American Ghost. That was how they were now referring to him. Dwayne Scala Johnson had become a myth on the move. But with every step forward, the noose tightened. A safe house in East Calden had already been burned. 2 contacts Dwayne trusted had gone silent. Lila was now the most valuable liability in the country, and he was a moving target with a $10 million billboard painted across his back. Still, they pressed on. He kept her fed. Kept her safe. In the quiet moments between movement and hiding, he told her fragments of his past, not the glossy parts from interviews or red carpets, but the things no one knew. Growing up with nothing. Fists before fame. Losses that carved him deeper than any stunt injury ever had. And why the silence of forests meant more to him than any award on a shelf. She listened. And slowly, trust began to bloom in the space between words. They crossed state lines under night fog, avoided checkpoints, used old trails from smugglers and hikers. By the 5th day, Dwayne had aged a year in his mind. Lila had shed her fear-like skin, and in its place now stood resolve. She wanted to fight. She wanted to take everything she knew and drag it into the light. But Dwayne wasn't ready to let her go, not yet. Then came the ambush. A roadside motel outside of Ridge Hollow. They had checked in late, exhausted, thinking they'd earned a brief pause. But Marzano's net had already reached the desk clerk. At 3:07 a.m., Dwayne woke to the sound of a boot creaking outside the window. 3 men. Suppressed weapons. No warning. But he was ready. The first man stepped through the door. Dwayne grabbed his wrist mid-draw, crushed his windpipe with a blow to the throat. The second fired twice, missed. Dwayne tackled him through the dresser, silencing him with the butt of the fallen pistol. The third tried to run. He didn't make it far. Blood stained the carpet. Sirens never came. Lila sat on the bed, stunned but composed. The world had gone feral around them. And now, Dwayne knew what had to come next. This wasn't about running anymore, this was about ending it. The road into the city was washed in a dull gray haze, as if the world itself had dimmed in anticipation of what was coming. Dwayne kept the engine quiet beneath him, the hum of the dirt bike swallowed by the rising fog. Lila clung behind him, her arms tight around his torso, head low. The motel incident had changed something, not just in her, but in him as well. This wasn't protection anymore. It was purpose. A reckoning waiting to unfold. The city loomed ahead, not one of towering glass and chrome, but one carved in brick and smoke. Rusted water towers stood like forgotten sentinels above factory roofs. Abandoned trains sat on silent rails, windows shattered like gaping mouths. This was Fallmore, Marzano's cradle of corruption. Not the glittering front his name wore in public, but the place where the blood flowed beneath the surface. Here, everything had a price. And everyone had a role to play. They ditched the bike under a loading dock, covered it in grime and loose tarp. Dwayne knew the streets well enough, he'd shot a film here once, years back. He remembered alleyways, service routes, the way shadows fell at different hours. But now, he wasn't returning for a premiere. He was returning as prey. And predator. They moved through the underbelly of the city with the precision of ghosts. An old friend of Dwayne's, Marcus "Chalk" Keene, a former stuntman turned underground tech smuggler, had agreed to meet them at an out-of-use parking garage on the East End, under the cover of dusk. Chalk owed Dwayne a life. And in Fallmore, that meant something. The garage reeked of oil and dust, but it was private. Quiet. Chalk had arrived first, crouched near a stripped-down SUV with a laptop balanced on the hood. He looked up, tension easing only slightly when he saw Dwayne's face. His eyes then slid to Lila, calculating, understanding. Without much talk, Chalk got to work. Through hacked access points and backdoor scrapers, he pulled up surveillance routes, Marzano's known safehouses, registered properties, offshore ledgers, the digital skeletons buried beneath years of shell identities. With Lila's information and Chalk's access, the net began to form. Marzano wasn't just laundering cash or moving product, he was running a syndicate that touched everything from tech shipments to political bribes. The logistics firm was just one nerve ending. Lila's data had the potential to collapse him, and that meant she was more than a target. She was a weapon. But she couldn't be both. Dwayne had to get her out. Chalk made arrangements. A contact in the Northern District, off-grid, ex-Special Forces, with access to a Black Route helipad. It would take time. Time they didn't have. Word was already out, Dwayne had been seen in Fallmore. A diner waitress recognized him. A kid had snapped a blurry photo. Within hours, Marzano's network would light up like a wildfire. So Dwayne made the call. He would go alone. He'd draw the fire, lead it away from Lila, and clear a path. She would stay in hiding with Chalk until the contact arrived. There was no arguing. Not anymore. This was war. At dusk, Dwayne stepped back into the city streets, his silhouette swallowed by the steam rising from manhole covers and the rustle of pigeons roosting under power lines. He wore a hooded jacket, sleeves rolled, eyes scanning. Every block held danger. A corner boy with a burner phone. A parked car with its lights off just a second too long. Sirens in the distance that never came closer. They were watching. The first attempt came on 5th and Grove. A pedestrian brushed too close. Dwayne felt the steel shift in the man's pocket, caught the glint of a concealed pistol. The fight was over in 2 moves, a wrist lock, a spin, and the man hit the pavement hard, dazed and breathless. Dwayne kept moving, slipping into the growing chaos. They came in waves after that. A man with a crowbar in an alley. 2 women in a laundromat, each armed and silent. A delivery driver who wasn't a driver at all. But Dwayne moved like a phantom with fists of stone. The years of choreographed combat on set were nothing compared to what life had taught him in the quiet. Bones cracked. Blood spilled. By the time he reached the industrial riverfront, 6 bodies lay behind him, none dead, all broken enough to remember him. Then came the message. An SUV pulled up. Not like the others. This one clean, black, reinforced. The driver, an older man with salt-gray stubble, stepped out holding a phone. He didn't speak. He just held it up. On the screen, a live video feed. Lila. Tied to a chair. Gagged. Eyes wide. Chalk too, bound beside her, bruised and beaten. The screen went black. Dwayne didn't move. Not right away. The older man handed him a folded note. Inside, 1 sentence, handwritten in elegant ink, "Come home, hero. Let's talk." Beneath it, an address. One Dwayne recognized. Marzano's estate. An old-world villa fused with industrial might, standing on the city's highest ridge, overlooking every broken thing it controlled. Cameras. Guards. Steel gates. It was a fortress disguised as opulence. Dwayne's jaw clenched. The man drove away, not bothering to look back. He stood in the silence, feeling the chill of the wind cut through his sleeves. His fists tightened at his sides. This was it. He didn't go back for weapons. He didn't need them. The night stretched long ahead of him as he walked toward the heart of the storm, each step grounded in a promise he had made, not just to Lila, but to himself. This would end. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. The road to Marzano's estate wound like a serpent through the northern edge of Fallmore, climbing in slow, deliberate curves that overlooked the city's decay. It was designed to impress, to intimidate. A fortress masquerading as wealth. Iron gates loomed ahead, blackened by age, but lined with polished gold trim. 2 armed men stood on either side, fingers near triggers, eyes hollow. They didn't stop him. They knew who was coming. The gates hissed open, slow and theatrical, and Dwayne stepped through, feeling the gravel crunch beneath his boots. Tall hedges flanked the driveway, trimmed with surgical precision. Spotlights hummed above, casting pools of pale light on marble statues, angels with broken wings, Greek warriors mid-battle. An omen. Maybe. Ahead, the villa stood in silence, a beast of stone and steel. Massive columns held up a balcony trimmed in wrought iron. Windows were narrow, deliberate, like eyes carved into a skull. Dwayne moved forward, posture calm, shoulders loose, but his heart a slow drumbeat of readiness. Every footstep was a countdown. Every breath, a decision. The doors opened before he reached them. Inside, the scent of cigars and aged scotch curled through the air. Polished floors reflected crystal chandeliers. Somewhere, distant music played, a string quartet behind a velvet curtain of pretense. At the far end of the hall, behind a long dining table of carved oak, stood Marzano. He was smaller than Dwayne expected, not in stature, but presence. A man in his 60s, thin, almost regal, with white slicked-back hair and a custom suit stitched like a second skin. His eyes were pale, unreadable, like marble soaked in cold milk. Beside him, flanking the walls, stood 6 guards. Silent. Ready. Dwayne didn't blink. Marzano smiled without warmth. He gestured with a nod toward the seat across from him. Dwayne didn't move. He waited. Then, from behind a side door, Lila was brought in. Still tied, gagged, but conscious. A bruise shadowed her temple, and blood marked her lip. She looked at Dwayne. The room around her seemed to vanish. There was nothing in her eyes but trust. She believed in him. No matter the odds. No matter the cost. Marzano watched Dwayne with interest, like a man appraising a wild animal finally caught. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. Smooth, like poison in expensive glass. He talked of opportunity, of negotiation. He spoke of legacies, of power, of control. But Dwayne heard none of it. His gaze flicked from guard to guard, counting muscle, noting posture, stance, weapons. Timing. Marzano stepped closer, lowering his voice. He mentioned the girl, how useful she could be, how easily accidents happen. How forgiveness could be bought if the right message was sent. One death. One public apology. One kneel. Dwayne said nothing. Then Marzano stepped back and nodded. The first guard moved. But Dwayne was already in motion. His chair flew backward with a crash. His leg swept low, knocking the nearest man off balance. He caught a baton midair and drove it into the guard's throat before spinning to disarm the second. A blade flashed, too late. Dwayne twisted the attacker's arm behind his back, dislocating the shoulder with a brutal snap. Gunfire erupted. Shouts followed. Dwayne dove behind the long dining table, flipping it in one motion, using its solid oak frame as a shield. The room filled with chaos, bullets tearing into the walls, shattering statues, splintering wood. Marzano vanished behind the corridor like a serpent into smoke. Dwayne leapt from cover, grabbed a fallen pistol, and moved like a storm, swift, merciless. He downed the third guard with 2 shots, then kicked the fourth into the wall, slamming his head against the plaster with a dull crack. Lila screamed through the gag as one of the last guards grabbed her, pressing a knife to her throat. Dwayne froze. His aim precise. His stance unwavering. He waited for the moment, that flicker of arrogance, the sliver of doubt, and then fired. One shot. Clean. The guard dropped, blade clattering. Dwayne rushed forward, untied Lila with practiced hands, yanked off the gag. She gasped, tears streaking through dirt on her face. He pulled her into his arms just long enough to know she was alive. Then he stood. Marzano was still here. Somewhere in this house. They moved quickly through the estate, room by room. Dwayne told her where to hide, a steel pantry in the kitchen, triple locked. She didn't argue. She knew he wouldn't stop until it was over. The final act had begun. Dwayne followed the trail, blood drops, open doors, smeared footprints. Down a corridor. Through a hidden stairwell. Into the lower levels of the house, where luxury gave way to shadows. The basement was cold, lit by hanging bulbs swaying gently. It smelled of iron and dust and money long buried. At the end of the corridor, a reinforced door stood ajar. Inside, a room like a war bunker. Monitors. Weapon racks. Vaults. A metal desk covered in files and ledgers. And behind it, Marzano. He held a knife. Dwayne stepped inside, silent. Marzano didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He simply smiled, a thin, resigned grin, and lunged. The knife came fast. Dwayne caught the wrist, but the blade turned. A burning line sliced across his shoulder. He grunted, drove his knee into Marzano's gut, forcing him back. But the old man fought like a cornered animal, precise, efficient, lethal. They grappled. Metal clashed against muscle. The knife came again, grazing Dwayne's ribs. Blood soaked his shirt. But then came the moment. Marzano's arm extended too far. Dwayne seized the elbow, twisted, drove the man into the wall, disarming him. The knife clattered to the floor. Dwayne didn't hesitate. A punch thundered into Marzano's jaw, once, twice, a third time. The fourth cracked like lightning. And then silence. Marzano crumpled to the floor. Neck twisted. Eyes empty. It was over. Dwayne staggered, breathing heavy, blood dripping from his arm. His shoulder throbbed with heat. But he was alive. And he wasn't done yet. On the desk, a laptop glowed. Still open. Still logged in. Dwayne sat, hands slick with blood, and began to search. Passwords. Bank accounts. Offshore holdings. A trail of zeros. He found it all. 500 million. He divided it. Half to an untraceable account tied to Lila's name. The other half to his own. Then he accessed the network, Marzano's own encrypted channel. He found the bounty listing, the code that marked him for death. With one stroke, he removed it. Cleared the threat. Wiped his trace. He was no longer the hunted. And Lila, she was now the richest protected witness in the world. When he returned to her, still hidden in the kitchen's steel cocoon, her eyes locked on his, fear melting into something softer. They didn't speak. He just held her. And in that stillness, something new began. They didn't stay in the estate. Not for long. The moment the silence settled and the scent of blood began to turn, Dwayne knew it was time to go. The villa would be discovered. If not by police, then by Marzano's remaining foot soldiers, the ones who didn't know he was already cold on the basement floor. He moved quickly through the house, gathering anything of use. A black duffel bag filled with burner phones, hard drives, bundles of unmarked bills, spare ammunition, and forged IDs. He wrapped Lila's coat tighter around her shoulders as they stepped out into the night, no words spoken between them, only the weight of what had been done and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. The stars above Fallmore seemed brighter now, almost surreal in contrast to the darkness they were leaving behind. They moved on foot for several miles through industrial backstreets, skirting traffic cameras, avoiding light. Dwayne moved like a machine, wounded, but steady. Lila followed without complaint, her steps quiet, eyes alert, no longer the frightened girl from the forest. At a rail yard on the edge of the city, they found an old maintenance shed where Chalk had stashed a clean vehicle, a matte gray Land Rover with blackout plates and no digital signature. Dwayne checked the undercarriage, the fuel line, the ignition. Everything was clean. They drove in silence, heading northwest, crossing state lines before dawn touched the horizon. Somewhere near the border of Rosedale County, they stopped to rest. A forgotten cabin near a dried-up lake, buried in overgrowth, padlocked but easy to breach. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old paper, but it was dry, safe, unlisted. Dwayne secured the perimeter. Lila made coffee in a warped kettle she found under the sink. The quiet was thick between them, not awkward, just heavy, meaningful. The kind of silence only shared by those who've survived something that should have destroyed them. Dwayne's shoulder wound was worse than he'd let on. The gash from Marzano's blade was deep, angry, and raw. He gritted his teeth while Lila cleaned it with the precision of someone who'd learned fast under fire. She stitched him carefully with a needle she sterilized over the stove flame. He didn't flinch. Not once. He simply watched her, not just with gratitude, but something deeper, respect, admiration, something harder to name. When she finished, she sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like days, he let his body lean just slightly into hers. Not weakness. Not dependence. Just trust. News traveled slower now that Marzano was gone. The bounty was lifted, the networks quiet, the encrypted message from Dwayne's hand shutting down dozens of dark market alerts. He wasn't hunted anymore. But that didn't mean they were safe. Marzano had lieutenants. Men who'd claw for control. Others who'd assume the vacuum left behind. A beast may lose its head, but its limbs still twitch. Dwayne spent hours digging through the stolen hard drives, mapping connections, tracing transfers, building a web of names and faces that stretched from Fallmore to foreign ports, politicians, military contractors, cartels. The rabbit hole was deep. But not endless. There was an end to it. A point of collapse. If he followed it long enough, he could burn the rest of the empire down. Lila watched him work, absorbing every line of code, every map, every whispered name. She had changed. Hardened. Not cold, but focused. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for every name hidden in the files they'd unlocked. Dwayne told her she didn't have to go any further. That she could disappear now, live somewhere quiet, rebuild. But she only looked at him, and in that gaze he saw the same flame he carried, the refusal to leave something broken when you had the power to set it right. Together they moved again, this time by plane, private, unregistered, bought in cash through one of Marzano's own laundered fronts. They flew west, into a city built on silence and wealth, where the next tier of this machine hid behind tinted skyscrapers and philanthropic press releases. Here, the men wore power like tailored suits and drank loyalty from crystal glasses. Dwayne and Lila became ghosts again, slipping into the cracks, forging identities, posing as consultant and intern. Every step closer to the core brought new threats, men who watched elevators from behind mirrored walls, black sedans parked outside hotels, helicopters that hovered a little too long over rooftops. But they kept moving, collecting, documenting, passing evidence into the right hands, not the corrupted systems, but the few good people still buried inside them. The kind who'd been waiting for a spark. And Dwayne, for all his strength, all his scars and skill, began to see that what they were building wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning. A dismantling of something that had hidden in plain sight for too long. And Lila, she was no longer the girl who'd screamed in the woods. She was fire now. Focused. Fierce. And still, through all of it, they held something between them. A quiet connection. A bond forged not by romance, but by shared survival. A trust deeper than words, unshaken by fear. The world would come for them again. In new forms. Under new names. But Dwayne had already made peace with what he'd become. Not the man on the screens. Not the icon. But the force behind the silence. And now, with Lila by his side, there was no turning back. Only forward. Into the next shadow. Into the heart of the machine. To finish what they started, they moved through cities like wind through cracks, never leaving a trace, always one step ahead of the shadow that tried to reform behind them. Every building they entered became a ghost after they left, every contact encrypted, every signal burned after use. They weren't just chasing leads anymore, they were executing a plan. The files Dwayne had pulled from Marzano's laptop weren't just financial logs, they were blueprints, revealing structures deeper and older than he had expected. Arms deals layered beneath disaster relief. Construction projects that funneled funds into destabilizing governments overseas. A mining operation run entirely by trafficked labor. It was global, rooted in places with no headlines, only whispers. And somewhere within that sprawl of dirt and digital silence lived the last piece of the machine, the one Marzano had answered to. His name was never used directly, only initials, DV. A myth, even among killers. A man who never appeared in photos, who moved through satellite dead zones and brokered wars over dinner. If Marzano was the skeleton, DV was the brain stem. And now, Dwayne was after him. The trail led them north, into a region of harsh wind and sharper secrets, where pine forests rolled into gray mountains and the sky always seemed 10 degrees colder. It was here, hidden behind layers of shell corporations and artificial ownerships, that they found the Black Summit compound. On paper, it was an ecological research station, funded by unnamed trusts and guarded by men with no uniforms. But the air around it hummed with something far from nature. It took them a week to find a way in. They watched from the woods, sleeping under frost, rationing heat, using night vision and drones hacked from abandoned military stock. Lila worked beside Dwayne, no longer just a strategist, she was the blade now, sharp and unafraid. She learned to pick locks, bypass infrared, ghost through surveillance. She moved like she'd been born for this life. And Dwayne, hardened by scars and driven by memory, had never moved with more clarity. He had no illusions now. This wasn't justice. This was extraction. This was surgery. Cut deep enough and maybe, just maybe, the system would bleed out. On the third night, they struck. Dressed in cold black gear, faces masked, weapons silent. They breached the perimeter at 2:14 a.m., slipping past guards using the same patterns Dwayne had seen rehearsed by private militias a decade earlier. Inside, the halls were sterile, concrete walls and motion sensors, but they were ready. They disabled the grid within minutes, plunging the interior into emergency red. It was Lila who found the server room, who cracked the encrypted vaults behind 3 layers of false storage. Inside, names, images, video archives. The truth. Every official bought, every journalist silenced, every threat erased. Proof. More than enough. And at the heart of it, a file tagged with one word, directive. Dwayne opened it. A single live feed. A man in a high-backed chair. Face shrouded in half-shadow. The voice, when it came through the speakers, was calm and measured. He said Dwayne's full name. Said Lila's. Congratulated them. Told them this was cute. That they'd made it farther than anyone before. But that the game hadn't changed. Only the players. Then the alarms hit. Heavy boots above. Reinforcements. Not guards. Killers. Teams of them. Dwayne moved fast, downloading what he could while Lila copied backups to a drive the size of her thumb. They torched the rest. Fires licking across plastic racks, smoke curling up into the ventilation shafts. As they escaped, bullets cracked through walls. Dwayne laid suppressing fire behind them, moving with brutal efficiency, each step calculated, each shot a final word. Lila didn't miss once. They reached the forest line with blood on their sleeves and data in hand. They didn't speak for hours. Just ran. Moved. Hid. Regrouped. By morning, they were miles from the compound, crouched in a shelter beneath old stone, breathing steam into the cold air. And in that breath, in the silence, Dwayne knew something had shifted again. They weren't just survivors now. They were finishers. DV knew their names. But now they knew his face. With the data, they began the next phase. A leak. Not to governments. Not to news channels bought and sold. They released everything to the people, coded networks, activist groups, deep web corridors where truth grew teeth. They uploaded everything. Footage of backroom deals. Lists of victims. Audio tapes. Maps. Passwords. And a live stream that looped Marzano's last moments on a secure channel seen by hundreds of thousands before it was torn down. The world reacted like a gut-punched animal. Markets staggered. Names disappeared. Several officials resigned overnight. One was found dead. Panic spread through elite circles like a virus. The machine was convulsing. Shutting down corridors. Burning files. Running scared. But DV was still out there. And Dwayne wanted to look him in the eye. It took weeks. Sleepless, hunted weeks. But eventually, the last piece fell. A private island off the coast of an eastern republic, listed as a preservation zone, protected by international law. Untouchable. Isolated. But not invisible. Dwayne planned the approach in silence. Lila watched him, understanding without words what he was about to do. This one he would do alone. She argued once. Just once. Then handed him the last drive. It contained the Purge Code, a program that would destroy everything DV had left. Legacy. Access. Reputation. With it, the myth would become dust. Dwayne reached the island under the black of moonless sky, smuggled by a rebel crew who never asked his name. He landed without welcome, and walked barefoot across the white sand like a man visiting his own grave. The guards were elite. Private war dogs. He took them apart like puzzles, silently, efficiently. No time for mercy. No space for fear. He found DV in a glass tower above the water. Alone. No guards. No panic. Just the man and his wine and his smirk. Dwayne didn't speak. He placed the drive on the table between them and watched DV blink, realization dawning. Then Dwayne hit send. Every screen in the tower went black. Every vault began to erase. DV reached for a weapon, too late. Dwayne disarmed him in one strike. The blade flashed once, cut shallow across Dwayne's side. It didn't matter. He moved through it. And when the moment came, when the man before him finally saw his own end in the reflection of Dwayne's eyes, there was no speech. No justice. Only silence. And a final breath. Dwayne stood over the body as the tower lights flickered and died. Then he walked out into the salt wind and vanished before the sun could rise. Lila waited for him far away, somewhere green, somewhere forgotten by systems and names. He returned days later, quieter, a little slower, but whole. They didn't talk about what happened. They didn't need to. The machine was dead. The money they took was hidden, used to rebuild lives shattered by the syndicate. The rest burned. They bought a house by a lake, where fog rolls low in the morning and birds sing without fear. Some nights they sat on the porch in silence, her hand resting on his, the past curled like smoke behind them, the future wide and unwritten. The world believed Dwayne Scala Johnson had vanished. Maybe he had. But in that silence, he found what he'd always chased. Not vengeance. Not justice. Peace. The seasons shifted without ceremony, as if the world itself had exhaled and finally let go. In the quiet hills beyond the lake, the air had taken on a crisp stillness that made every morning feel like the first of a new chapter. Dwayne no longer woke to the sound of sirens or the ticking rhythm of distant threats. He woke to birdsong and the soft rustle of pine needles moving gently in the breeze. The house they lived in was modest, built of old timber and stone, nestled into a slope that overlooked water so calm it mirrored the sky. Lila had taken to gardening, not obsessively, but with a kind of reverent calm, coaxing life out of the soil like she was repairing something deep inside herself. Dwayne would sometimes watch her from the window while nursing a cup of black coffee, the same way one might watch a flame dance, aware that something powerful lived in the quiet. They didn't speak about what had come before. There was no need. The world behind them had collapsed under the weight of its own rot. Names were erased. Fortunes dissolved. The power structure that had once moved entire governments now existed only in footnotes and hushed theories traded by desperate remnants of fallen circles. Every so often, whispers would reach them, messages funneled through encrypted channels Dwayne still monitored out of habit, not paranoia. Men from the old world trying to regroup, small networks testing the silence to see if it would echo back. It never did. Dwayne had made sure of that. The final purge had wiped not just data, but people, ghost operators, synthetic accounts, entire proxy chains. When he'd left the tower on that island, he hadn't just killed a man. He'd killed a system. What remained now were scattered pieces, fractured alliances, and the kind of fear that made even the most ruthless question their next move. And yet, peace hadn't made Dwayne soft. He still trained. Every morning like ritual. Running before dawn, weights forged from stones and steel in a makeshift shed, his body a machine maintained not out of vanity, but readiness. Not for battle, but to stay grounded. Purpose didn't disappear with war, it simply changed shape. Lila noticed this, and though she never said it, she understood it in the way she watched him. In the way her hand sometimes found his in the middle of the night, when dreams brought ghosts, and even silence could feel loud. They lived simply. Off the grid. Solar panels. Water from the hills. Food from the garden and weekly supply runs into the nearest village, where no one asked questions and everyone valued their own privacy too much to pry. Dwayne had built trust with a few locals, an old carpenter who taught him how to reinforce the roof beams, a baker who sold him coffee and smoked meats, a mechanic who admired the quiet, powerful way he moved and never once asked about the scar along his ribs. Lila, in turn, had found moments of joy in places she never thought she would again, pressing wildflowers into old books, sketching the changing colors of the hills, playing music late at night on a dusty record player they found in an antique barn. There were moments, rare but real, where Dwayne would catch her smiling with her whole face, not the cautious smile of someone who'd survived horror, but the real thing, unguarded, unburdened. And those moments were everything. One evening, after the first snow had begun to lace the treetops, they sat by the fire while the wind curled outside like an old story trying to be told. Lila handed him a letter. It was from an international relief agency. A foundation. They'd traced a donation made from one of the ghost accounts Dwayne had used to funnel the remnants of Marzano's empire into real causes. Clean water. Education. Recovery. The letter was a thank you. No name. No return address. Just a note, we see what you did. We'll make it count. Dwayne folded the paper slowly and set it beside the fire. He didn't need thanks. He just needed to know it hadn't been for nothing. That all the blood, the pain, the running, it had opened a door for something better. And as he looked across the room at Lila, wrapped in a wool blanket, eyes glowing with the reflection of the flame, he realized something he hadn't been able to say out loud, even to himself. He was done running. The past didn't own him anymore. It had shaped him, yes, hammered him into something sharp and unyielding, but it didn't hold him. He held it now. Like a scar. A memory. Not a chain. And so they stayed. Through winter. Through thaw. Through the slow turning of seasons that no longer carried the weight of survival, but simply marked time like the rise and fall of breath. Some days he would write, nothing for anyone else, just fragments, thoughts, stories that never found pages. Other days he would fish. Or build. Or simply sit in the sunlight and feel it warm the stone steps beneath him. Life didn't explode back into color. It returned quietly. In rhythm. In patience. In presence. And though the world beyond their hills would always carry noise and corruption, war and greed, somewhere in the stillness, they had carved out something stronger. A place where truth lived without fear. Where love didn't need to be spoken every day to be felt in everything. And where a man like Dwayne, forged in fire, hunted and hardened by the worst of the world, could finally lay down his fists and just be. Not a symbol. Not a fugitive. Not a legend. Just a man. Free. The morning light crept slowly over the edge of the hills, casting long shadows across the frost-kissed grass as a faint mist rose from the surface of the lake like breath from a sleeping giant. Dwayne stood at the edge of the water, barefoot, the cold soaking into his skin, but he didn't move. His breath came in calm, even draws, his eyes fixed on the ripples that spread from a distant duck gliding across the glassy surface. This was how he began most days now, with silence. With stillness, with something that resembled reverence. Behind him, the house remained quiet, the windows still fogged from the night chill, the fire inside just embers now. Lila still slept, curled under thick blankets, one arm reaching into the empty space he had left behind. She knew where he was, and she knew he'd return. They had long passed the point of needing words for such things. The world had moved on without them, or maybe they had moved on without it. The news channels no longer carried their names, the bounty lists long erased, their digital trails scattered into noise. The last remnants of Marzano's syndicate had either gone underground or eaten each other alive in the scramble for what was left. Some tried to rebuild, to resurrect the bones of the empire, but the networks they once relied on were gone. Dwayne had made sure of that, system by system, file by file, piece by piece. It had been like pulling out the nerves of a beast one at a time, slow and merciless, until it could no longer move, no longer bite, no longer breathe. And when it was done, he had walked away, not because he was finished, but because there was nothing left to finish. He watched the lake for a while longer, then turned and walked back toward the house, the boards creaking under his steps as he crossed the porch and stepped inside. The warmth met him like a memory, firelight, coffee, her scent lingering in the air. Lila stirred when he entered, blinking slowly, hair tousled, eyes soft. He leaned down and kissed her forehead without a word, and she smiled, pulling the blanket higher, her fingers brushing the edge of his wrist as if to say, "I know you're here, that's all I need." Later, they made breakfast together, eggs, roasted potatoes, thick slices of bread she had baked the night before. The radio played faint jazz from an old station barely clinging to life somewhere in the low hills. Outside, the wind carried the calls of distant birds and the groan of trees waking in the cold. They spoke about small things, the garden, the repairs Dwayne needed to make to the shed, a book Lila had started and kept falling asleep before finishing. It was the kind of talk people took for granted, but not them. Every mundane word was a miracle. Every shared laugh a defiance of everything that had once tried to silence them. That afternoon, Dwayne walked into town for supplies. It was a long walk, a couple of hours each way, but he liked it. Liked the rhythm of it, the solitude. The path led through a grove of birches that turned golden as the sun began to tilt west, their leaves falling like lazy confetti over the mossy trail. The village was quiet, as always. A few familiar faces nodded at him, not out of recognition, but respect for his silence, the way he carried himself. People sensed when a man had seen too much, and they didn't ask questions. He bought flour, salt, coffee beans, and a small box of chocolates Lila liked. On the way back, he stopped by the stream that cut across the woods and watched the current for a while. Something inside him had changed, not just healed but reshaped, like steel cooled and tempered into something new. He didn't need violence anymore. Didn't crave it. But he would still answer it if it ever came knocking again. There was a quiet strength in knowing you could destroy something and choosing not to. Back home, Lila had lit candles in the windows and cooked a stew that filled the house with warmth and memory. They ate slowly, no rush, no need. Afterward, they sat near the fire, wrapped in the same blanket, his hand resting on her knee, her head on his shoulder. He felt her breathing slow, steady, calm. The past no longer chased them. The future didn't scare them. They existed fully in the present, and that was enough. Long after she had drifted off to sleep, Dwayne remained awake, staring into the fire, watching the flames rise and fall like old ghosts dancing their last dance. He thought about the people who hadn't made it, the ones who had suffered in silence while monsters in suits passed judgment from marble towers. He thought about the things he'd done, the blood on his hands, the bones broken by necessity. And he accepted them, not with pride, but without regret. They had led him here. To her. To peace. And if it ever came again, the dark, the chase, the war, he knew he would face it the same way. Not as a man looking to survive, but as a man who had already lived through the fire and come out clean. The wind picked up outside, rattling the glass just a little, and the flames shifted. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the sound carry him somewhere quiet, somewhere still. Not asleep, just resting. Just breathing. Just alive. The days began to stretch wider as spring bled into early summer, the forest thickening with new green, the lake warming enough that morning mist rose in thinner ribbons, fading faster beneath the rising sun. Dwayne had taken to chopping wood before breakfast, not out of necessity, but rhythm, the clean swing of the axe, the thud of the log splitting, the repetition grounding him like prayer. Lila had started keeping a journal, though she never called it that, just pages she filled in a quiet corner of the porch, her handwriting looping and elegant, her eyes often wandering to the trees before returning to the paper. Their life had settled into something whole, something real, a silence that didn't come from fear, but from fullness, from having said all that needed to be said without ever opening their mouths. On the 6th morning of June, a letter arrived. There was no return address, no stamp, just a sealed envelope tucked into the hollow of their mailbox at the edge of the road, the kind of message not left by mailmen, but by someone who knew how to disappear. Dwayne opened it at the kitchen table while the kettle whistled. Inside was a single card, ivory-colored, textured, unmarked save for the center where 5 words had been typed by machine in black ink: "It's not finished. He lives." No signature. No explanation. Just the weight of those 5 words sinking like iron into his chest. He said nothing to Lila that morning. He made breakfast like always, kissed her cheek, made her laugh when she spilled jam on the sleeve of her robe. But the silence behind his eyes had shifted. He tucked the card into the back of a drawer beneath old receipts and folded maps, then went for a walk that lasted most of the day. In his gut, he had known. Maybe not the details, but the shape of it, the unease that had never fully died, the sense that something had been left standing in the ashes he thought he'd buried. He returned after sundown, sweat-soaked and quiet, and Lila didn't ask. She just poured him a glass of water, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said nothing at all. That night he barely slept. He sat near the fire as it died to embers and watched shadows crawl across the walls like old memories. At dawn, he retrieved the card and looked at it again, memorizing the spacing of the letters, the depth of the pressure on the paper. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message crafted with care, something intentional, and Dwayne knew too much about people who used silence as weapons to ignore it. A week passed. Then 2. No more letters. No movement in the woods. No strangers in town. But the feeling lingered, heavy behind his ribs, tightening with each hour. He started scanning the bands again, secure radio frequencies he hadn't touched in months. He ran trace sweeps on old networks. Most were dead. But one pinged. A low signal buried beneath layers of encryption, coded in a format he hadn't seen since the early stages of the Marzano takedown. The signal pulsed once every 40 minutes, from somewhere near the coast. It was faint, unstable, but it was a voiceprint. Not DV's. Someone else. Someone who had survived the collapse. Dwayne spent days in the shed analyzing the waveform, comparing it against archived files he hadn't opened since the war ended. The match was imperfect, about 87%. But that was enough. The voice belonged to one of the handlers, an operations strategist once listed as dead in an internal detonation during the syndicate's final weeks. A man named Keller. He had been the architect of contingency protocols, the one they'd trusted to bury the evidence if it ever came to light. And somehow, he was still breathing. Still sending signals. Still watching. Dwayne didn't tell Lila what he found. He watched her work in the garden, her hands in the dirt, her hair pulled back, the way she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. He saw her peace. And he couldn't bring the fire back into that. Not unless he had to. So he waited. But on the 30th day after the letter, everything changed. He returned from a supply run to find the cabin door ajar, just barely, like it had been closed gently and not latched. The lock wasn't broken. There were no signs of struggle. But he knew, Someone had been inside. The air felt wrong. Colder. Touched. Lila was safe. Unharmed. But shaken. She told him she had gone to hang laundry behind the cabin, and when she returned, her journal was gone. Nothing else. Just the pages she had poured herself into for months. Stolen like a message in a bottle. Dwayne's face didn't change. He simply took her hand, held it, and whispered that it was okay, but deep inside him, the silence cracked. He stayed up that night, watching the tree lean with a rifle across his lap, listening for something that never came. By morning, he had made his decision. He told Lila the truth, about the letter, the signal, Keller. About the fear that had never fully left him. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only nodded, then told him something he hadn't expected. If you go, I go too. He tried to say no. She shook her head. There was no discussion. Whatever ghost had risen from the dead wasn't just after him. It was watching both of them. Reading her words. Digging into the life they'd built. And she would not be left behind while it burned. Dwayne packed lightly. 2 bags. 1 rifle. 1 pistol. Rations. Maps. The burner phone. Lila packed notebooks, a small camera, and her resolve. At dawn they left the cabin behind, locking the door behind them like they were leaving home for the last time. They moved east, toward the coast, toward the signal. Toward whatever was waiting with eyes open and secrets still buried. Not running this time. Not hiding. Moving like 2 figures carved from silence, walking into a storm that hadn't finished speaking. They reached the coast under a sky choked with low gray clouds, the kind that pressed down on the land like a warning, and the air carried the sharp tang of salt and rust, blending with the scent of wet concrete and old diesel. The city near the shoreline was half forgotten, a stretch of weather-beaten piers and shuttered factories, warehouses with no names, windows boarded up with rotting planks and caution tape fluttering like tattered flags. It was the kind of place where people vanished without question and old ghosts walked in daylight. They moved through it unnoticed, dressed like locals, heads low, eyes scanning, their presence a whisper folded into the decay. Dwayne tracked the signal to a point just beyond the industrial grid, an old shipping terminal listed as condemned but still drawing electricity through a buried line that had never been shut off. From the outside, it looked empty, fences rusted open, gates collapsed, graffiti fading from years of rain, but inside, the hum of machines still lived, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat underwater. They waited until dark. Then they moved. Through the fence. Over gravel. Between containers stacked like tombstones. Lila carried the tools. Dwayne carried the weight. They breached the side entrance at 2:11 a.m., the same hour he had once taken down Marzano's fortress, like fate echoing itself in time. The interior was gutted and hollow, filled with shadow and echo, but in the center of the floor, surrounded by floodlights and security drones, stood a single command node, a cube of steel and glass pulsing faint green. And seated behind it, like a man waiting for confession, was Keller. Older now, thinner, his hair grayer than the last known footage, but his eyes the same, sharp, cold, brilliant. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't run. He only looked up as they approached, then smiled, that slow, confident smile of a man who had prepared for every outcome except this one. Dwayne stopped 5 feet away. Every muscle still, every breath measured. Keller spoke calmly, his voice like oil poured onto quiet water, and he told them everything. How the collapse had been expected. How Marzano had been sacrificed by design. How DV had been real, but never the head, only another rung in a deeper chain, and how Keller had simply stepped sideways while the rest burned. He said it without pride. Without guilt. Just facts. He spoke of contingencies. Of data caches. Of systems still embedded in governments and corporations, roots too deep to pull without shattering the world. He said their crusade had been noble but naive. That justice wasn't about ending evil, it was about managing it. Dwayne said nothing. Lila did. She stepped forward and placed a small device on the table. Keller looked at it, frowned, then finally showed fear. It was a trigger. A virus. Something Dwayne and Lila had built together over the past few weeks, based on the stolen signal code. It would crawl backward through the last known uplinks, isolate Keller's backups, and erase them in a slow, irreversible sweep, not instantly, but over the course of 30 hours. Long enough for the world to notice. For the void to be seen. For the rot to be exposed in a way that couldn't be silenced. Keller reached for the device, but Dwayne caught his wrist. Just a touch. Firm. Final. And in that touch, Keller understood that there would be no negotiation, no escape. His silence was acceptance. They left him there, seated alone under the lights, his empire unraveling in real time, powerless to stop it. As they stepped back into the night, rain began to fall, soft and steady, washing the dust from the docks, the kind of rain that made everything feel new, even if only for a moment. By the time the sun rose, the first leaks had begun. News outlets scrambled. Secure lines overloaded. Officials denied, then disappeared. Names cracked open like bones under pressure. The world stirred. And Dwayne and Lila vanished into it once more. Not as fugitives. Not as legends. Just as two people who had seen the worst and decided it would never touch them again. They returned to the hills weeks later, their cabin untouched, the woods unchanged, the lake as still as when they had left it. No more letters came. No more signals. Only wind. Only peace. The journal was never found. But Lila started a new one. And Dwayne, for the first time in years, started writing too. Stories. Memories. The truth dressed as fiction, hidden in the lines of prose no one would read but her. They grew older there, side by side, not afraid of time, but grateful for every quiet day it gave them. And in the stillness of that life, beneath the trees and the endless turning of the sky, Dwayne Scala Johnson was no longer the man who ran toward screams or away from shadows. He was just a man. One who had walked through fire and laid down his fists not because he was tired, but because he had finally won. And peace, after all, was not something that waited for you at the end of war. It was something you built, one breath at a time, one morning at a time, one silent, perfect moment at a time, until the noise of the world could no longer reach you, and never would again.